The worn leather of the overseer's glove, cracked and stained by endless summers under the sun, lingered like a silent witness in the heavy air of the Mississippi plantation. The land stretched beyond, a flat expanse of cotton and dust, but its surface barely betrayed the violence woven into its roots. No ledger entry could capture the sound of a rope pulled taut or the scrape of worn wooden shackles rubbing raw skin. In the year 1852, under the relentless southern sun, 4 enslaved souls held a secret. The weight of their decision pressed on their backs and whispered in the heat-thick night air. Would their desperate act of vengeance fracture the chains that bound them, or simply tighten the noose? The plantation was a self-sustaining world unto itself, rigid in its brutality and routine. From dawn, the overseer's voice cut through the cicada hum, an iron command shaping each moment of forced labor. This was not merely a farm, it was a system governed by laws carved deep into the land and flesh alike. The slave codes of Mississippi dictated the boundaries of life and death, enshrining the overseer's whip as a grim instrument of order. The cotton fields, endless and merciless, bore witness to scars mapped in crimson. Laborers wore coarse linen shirts and threadbare trousers, their hands calloused by the sting of sun and soil, their breaths ragged in the thick air. The cycle of punishment and survival ebbed and flowed like the tides of the nearby river, relentless, unyielding. But beneath this iron surface lay hushed voices and whispered plans, shadows weaving secrets in the small cabins, hidden within the plantation's vast reach. 4 figures lingered in the darkness, hands trembling as they tightened knots and exchanged furtive glances, bound together by a shared fury. Their hearts thundered in time with the scrape of rope and clatter of tools, each sound a pulse in the slow build of rebellion. Would the night hold their secret, or would the wind carry their cries into the unforgiving daylight? The whip, a tool twisted from domination and pain, would itself become their weapon of reckoning. This intangible transformation was as fragile as the thin cotton threads that clothed their bodies, yet fierce as the fire simmering beneath their skin. In the silence of the quarters, the air tasted of sweat and ash, a stark reminder of the overseer's cruelty etched into countless memories. His shadow, long and crooked, prowled the fields by day and haunted the dreams by night. Records imply that his punishments were savage, swift, a manifestation of a system that sought not only to control bodies, but to break spirits. Yet, the very instruments of his power, ropes, whips, chains, were turned back upon him in a defiant act that would ripple beyond the fields. How does one measure justice when meted in strokes of pain? Would their vengeance unravel the fabric of their captivity, or simply weave new patterns of despair? As the 4 moved together under moonless skies, the world seemed to contract to the tactile, rough rope against calloused fingers, stale air thick with anticipation, and the muted crack of leather against flesh. Their breaths came in shallow bursts, eyes darting for unseen dangers. The act they committed was irreversible, a fracture in the plantation's facade. In that moment, the whip was no longer a symbol of oppression alone. It was an exclamation of survival, a violent punctuation in the long, silent story of resistance. As dawn threatened the horizon, the future hung suspended on this visceral barter between pain and power, cruelty and courage. The lash would crack, not just on the overseer's flesh, but across the fractured soul of a system whose shadows still lengthen today. The bell's harsh clang tore through the humid dawn, bidding the enslaved laborers to awake from restless, brief slumbers. Their bodies, worn and aching from the previous sun's relentless toil, obeyed the summons without pause. Among them, hands rubbed coarse linen against scraped skin, eyes half closed against the thick silkiness of the Mississippi heat. But duty to the fields was immediate. These were the hours when shadows clung to the gnarled branches of cotton stalks, yet a noose of vigilance tightened around the weary. From the nearby cabin, the overseer's cough rasped like a dry wood hinge creak, a small yet constant reminder of his looming presence. Morning routine swallowed the enslaved workers whole. A sparse ration of cornmeal mush sat like cold ash in handmade bowls, grounding the day's sustenance to its barest essence. The bitter tang of salted pork lingered faintly beneath, while cracked wooden spoons scratched softly against the bowl's edge. Gathering in their work gangs, 20 strong, shoulders stooped against the weight of expectation, they moved toward the endless cotton rows. Fingers, bloodied and scarred from ceaseless picking, brushed against stubborn bowls bursting with white lint. The crackle of brittle leaves mixed with whispered nothings, as every breath carried the weight of knowing fall behind, and the whip's bite awaited. How much can a body endure before spirit fractures? The ledger leaves gaps here, but fear's imprint is unmistakable. The work was gruesome discipline incarnate. 25 pounds of cotton, picked by one hand alone, marked a day's modest standard. The overseer demanded much more. Each misstep, a broken branch, a smear of blood upon the prize cotton, was a transgression reported in the sharp crack of whiplash. Under the sweltering sun, the overseer's shadow darted between laborers, vigilant and cruel. Failure meant lashes, 39 or more, mapping red stitches across backs left bare by torn shirts. The bell's toll at sundown brought scant relief. Hands blistered, backs aflame beneath coarse cotton cloth. In whispered corners, talk turned to the overseer himself. A man forged in cruelty, his voice a ragged whip cracking through the southern hush. Would rage born of such relentless pain find its measure? By midday, the oppressive heat thickened like wax, sweat mingling with the pervasive scent of earth and toil. Slaves stooped, hauling heavy sacks to the gin house, muscles trembling with exhaustion and hunger gnawing at their bones. The few scraps of salted pork and corn each week barely held the body together. Malnutrition and disease were constant specters. The overseer's orders were relentless, a constant drumbeat driving labor, while any mercy was buried deep in the delta soil. The oppressive system left no space for rest or defiance, yet hidden beneath this unyielding rhythm, small acts of quiet resistance flickered like fragile embers. Would these smoldering sparks ignite to burn through the plantation's iron grip? Evenings brought no solace. Cramped cabins suffocated families in their meager embrace, fireflies flickering against the windows like ghosts seeking escape. The thin fabric of night did little to mask whispered fears or muted prayers. Whispers of justice and vengeance meandered through the quarters, carried like secrets on the sticky summer breeze. The whip's memory lingered not only on flesh, but in the heartbeats of those bound by chains and fear. As the moon climbed high and cicadas droned their mournful canticles, the resolve of four grew taut as the rope they would soon wield. Would their courage fracture the weight of centuries? The whip was poised to speak, not merely as weapon, but as a trembling voice demanding reckoning. The overseer was both ghost and tyrant in the lives he haunted, a figure etched by harsh law and deeper cruelty. His presence was as much enforced by custom as by whip, legally sanctioned by slave codes that condoned violence as a tool of control. Under Mississippi law, enslaved people were forbidden even small assemblies, their bodies subject to brutal punishments at the overseer's whim. These legal strictures etched invisible chains, binding not just limbs but wills. The overseer's lash was presented as justice, its echo a harsh reminder of the fragile line between order and savagery. Yet within the system, the cracks appeared, voices rose in secret, hands prepared for revolt. How much longer could such a house of pain endure before it collapsed inward? As this day waned, the four conspirators moved deliberately. Fingers traced well-worn ropes, the coarse texture a cold comfort in nervous palms. Their breaths came shallow, mingled with the earthy scent of crushed leaves underfoot. The moment approached, charged with inevitable consequence. In the grip of uncertainty and fury, they bound the overseer, his flesh soon to bear the whip's full weight. This was no mere act of rebellion. It was a transformation of agony into agency. The whip's cracking would not only break skin, but also echo through generations, a concrete testament to a restless soul's call for justice amplified in the long shadows of history. The iron grip of Mississippi's slave codes in 1852 bent not only flesh, but the very will of those enslaved. These laws framed cruelty as order, sanctioning lashes as a first, sharp word, in a relentless conversation of control. Any slave caught wandering without a written pass faced immediate judgment, a sentence of up to 20 lashes, struck not by the overseer alone, but by any instrument the law permitted. The courthouse became a grim theater, where punishment served as spectacle and warning. The sting of 39 lashes was the common reproof for disobedience, a punishment meted out for offenses ranging from petty theft to the mere act of gathering in forbidden company. What were these laws, if not chains forged from blood and fear? Under this harsh legal canopy, the overseer was both judge and executioner, wielding a whip that spoke the cruel language of the state. The code left sparse room for mercy. For injuries perceived as assault or seditious speech, words twisted into weapons against those in power, the law extended penalties whose reach was long and painful. Fines, mutilations, and lashings bound enslaved bodies in authoritative silence. The ear nailed to a pillory, a gruesome symbol of public shaming, bore witness to the grotesque intersection of legality and savagery. The overseer's authority, buttressed by state sanction, fed a culture in which violence was not only expected, but celebrated as necessary. A brutal rhythm played out on the backs of men and women. How does justice survive in such a merciless court? Yet beneath the statutes lay an unyielding tension. The slave code's iron discipline was both shield and sword, attempting to suffocate rebellion even as it bred defiance. Enslaved people were forbidden from assembling without white supervision, and even worship required oversight, fracturing communal ties essential for resistance. Movements out of the master's sight were criminalized, driving suspicion into every footstep. This created a system that measured freedom by the length of a rope or the number of lashes delivered under the crackling Mississippi sun. Would such relentless oppression break spirits or ignite the embers of revolt? That summer, in 1852, 4 enslaved individuals navigated this landscape of oppression and regulation with wary precision. Their act of tying the overseer and wielding the whip was not mere retaliation, but an insurgent statement against a system that traded in human suffering. They transformed the instrument of their subjugation into the weapon of their resolve. Their defiance thrummed like a dark pulse beneath layers of plantation order, a question carved into the flesh and law itself. When the lash turns, who truly holds power? The whip's cruel echo would soon crack across more than skin. It would reverberate through the fragile boundaries of law, rebellion, and memory. The slave codes of Mississippi in 1852 cast a vast and merciless shadow over the lives of the enslaved. These laws decreed harsh punishments as the natural response to any breach, real or imagined, against the plantation's order. A slave found beyond the bounds of their master's land without a written pass risked 20 lashes, while unauthorized gatherings, especially for worship, were punishable by 39 lashes. The whip's brutal authority was enshrined in law, a tool wielded to silence dissent and enforce submission. But what justice steered such cruelty, and who counted the cost beyond the cracked skin? Punishments ranged from public lashings to mutilations that echoed the plantation's cold calculus. An ear nailed to a pillory before it was severed was a grotesque warning. Those accused of seditious speech or unlawful assembly were whipped with merciless precision. The overseer's role combined legal power with brutal exercise of will, acting as judge, jury, and executioner under the state's eyes. Records suggest the frequently meted 39 lashes was the common penalty, its aftermath a visible, aching testament on backs left stripped of cloth. Here law and violence bled into one another, each lash not just flesh but a message etched for the community to see. The codes extended into every facet of enslaved life: theft, assault, or even possession of firearm without authorization brought severe physical discipline. Slave patrols, emboldened by legal sanction, confined movement with ever-watchful eyes, restricting freedom to mere inches. Worship without white supervision was forbidden. Slaves caught assembling were punished not just for gathering, but for daring to forge bonds beyond control. This legal stranglehold transformed daily survival into a dangerous balancing act: how to live fully within unrelenting, unequal law, the ledger omits countless private sufferings shadowed in the public lash. Yet these cruel systems often carved cracks through which rebellion breathed. Every lash, every public humiliation, was a testament to a power welded by fear and submission, but also a latent tinder for resistance. The 4 enslaved who dared to bind and whip the overseer transformed the whip from an instrument of oppression into a symbol of retribution, a gesture carved with fury in a world that barred any other voice. When law and violence intertwine, where lies the boundary between justice and vengeance? The whip's sharp crack would answer this question beyond the plantation walls, echoing in the unsettled air of Mississippi's dark summer. The air inside the cramped slave quarters was thick with tension, as if the oppressive heat had seeped into the very walls. Under Mississippi's 1852 slave codes, any act of defiance was met with swift and brutal consequence. Written laws dictated that an enslaved person caught without a written pass, an absolute necessity for any movement beyond their master's land, could expect 20 lashes, administered without mercy or trial. This bureaucratic cruelty turned freedom into a daily lottery of risk and fear. How could one measure the weight of a piece of paper against the price of violated skin? The codes rendered the overseer a fearful arbiter of punishment with wide latitude. 39 lashes was the prescribed penalty for offenses ranging from petty theft to the forbidden assembly of enslaved people, gatherings that the law strictly forbidden unless attended by white supervisors. The whip's crack was law declaring itself in violent flesh. Records suggest that possession of firearms, seditious speech, or even literacy classes could earn an enslaved person this brutal sentence. The public nature of these punishments functioned as theater of power, inflicting pain both physical and psychological to deter others. Does law remain just when it is etched so painfully on the body? Further horrors lurked beyond lashings. Mutilations such as ear cropping, pillory displays, and branding were sanctioned punishments, symbols that marked the enslaved as property and warning. Some offenses, labeled as capital crimes, like arson or attempts to kill a white person, could result in execution by hanging, burning, or worse. The overseer's cruelty thus found both legal cover and ruthless expression. Even worship was under legal suspicion. Enslaved gathering for religious services had to meet stringent requirements of white attendance, reinforcing control over both body and soul. Would a system so entangled in violence and fear be able to sustain itself without cracking? Amid these iron laws, the 4 enslaved conspirators made their irreversible choice. Binding the overseer and turning the whip upon him was more than vengeance. It was a deliberate rebuttal of a legal structure designed to saw through hope with every lash. Their act questioned the very essence of power. If law's voice comes through pain and control, what happens when that voice is silenced by those it sought to command? The whip, once the tool of their torment, became their declaration. And so, under the hot Mississippi sky of 1852, the crack of leather ringing sharp and certain spoke a deeper truth, one that would echo far beyond the fields they had tilled in silence. The harsh clang of the courthouse bell marked the beginning of another day under the oppressive eye of Mississippi's 1852 slave codes. These laws, cold and uncompromising, dictated every facet of enslaved life, enforcement wielded as brutally as the whip itself. An enslaved person caught without a written pass risked 20 lashes. It was law's immediate physical verdict. The mandated 39 lashes for unauthorized gatherings or petty offenses were not just punishment, but spectacle, pain inflicted in public as warning. Yet, could justice reside in lashes drawn from law's cruel hand? Within the code's grip, the overseer held terrifying power, the executor of state-sanctioned brutality. Offenses as minor as petty theft or attending forbidden religious meetings invited lashings so severe that skin tore and bodies bore red stigmata of control. Capital crimes, arson, assault, rebellion opened the door to death, strangling any hope of mercy. Mutilations like ear cropping and pillorying were grotesque performances of domination, enforcing submission through fear and physical maiming. Was the overseer cruel by nature, or merely the instrument of a system bent on erasing freedom? The laws also monitored the enslaved's very gatherings, forbidding unsupervised assembly and dictating white oversight of worship. Slave patrols, empowered legally, tracked movements, fractured communities, and suppressed hope. These tactics tightened the grip of power, constraining enslaved people's ability to resist or even connect. Amidst this suffocating order, whispers of rebellion flickered, fragile and faint. The act of 4 enslaved people binding and whipping their overseer was a shattering rupture, a violent inversion of absolute control. When the whip's cruel voice turned, who truly commanded the field? This defiance would send tremors beyond the cotton rows. It challenged the legitimacy of laws born from blood and fear, questioning the boundary between submission and assertion, punishment and justice. The whip's crack, that ancient symbol of dominion, became a sharp, echoing declaration. The oppressed could strike back. As the Mississippi sun climbed high in 1852, the plantation trembled with guarded breaths. History's fractured soul stretched taut between vengeance and survival, awaiting the next telling. The courtroom at the plantation sat heavy with anticipation, its wooden beams groaning under the weight of unsaid confessions and the scent of damp earth. The trial of those 4 enslaved souls was less a legal proceeding than a display of a plantation's iron will. Mississippi's 1852 slave codes left little room for mercy or voice. No jury of peers, no fair hearing, only the stern decree of 3 judges seated without indictment or counsel for the accused. It was a procedure streamlined to swiftly smother any spark of resistance before it could spread. Who could call such a trial justice when verdicts were predetermined by chains and fear? The charges against them were grave: conspiracy, assault on a white man, sedition. The law named these acts capital offenses, punishable by hanging or worse, execution conducted publicly to torture both flesh and spirit. The overseer's testimony echoed, his voice sharp as the whip's crack, a thread stitching the government's power to plantation terror. Yet, accounts suggest that within these trials, truths were often twisted, fears magnified, and justice buried beneath intimidation. The 4 stood bound, their eyes averted, hands trembling, as the courtroom's heavy silence bore down like the Mississippi summer heat. Would this moment mark their end or the beginning of a long story of defiance? As the judges pronounced the sentence, the crack in the courtroom's air grew palpable. Sentencing to public punishment was certain. The whip's merciless lash a bind of law and pain. The 4 would become grim symbols of the price of rebellion, their bodies etched with scars meant to warn, but beneath the surface of shared dread flickered an unspoken resolve. Resistance was a living thing, hidden, enduring, harvesting strength from each act of defiance. The plantation's laws enforced submission with cruelty, but they could not erase a truth centuries old. Even chained, the human spirit seeks its freedom. Against this backdrop, the lash was not just punishment, it was a challenge and a call. The weight of the slave codes pressed down with merciless precision in 1852 Mississippi, where laws sought not just obedience, but the erasure of any spark of insubordination. The standard penalty for many offenses was the infamous 39 lashes, a number that became a brutal shorthand for control. From attending clandestine literacy classes to petty theft, any breach invited the overseer's whip, a living instrument sanctioned by law. Yet punishments escalated beyond lashings. Ear cropping, pillories, and branding served as permanent grotesque markers of perceived guilt. These public torments were meant to ripple beyond the punished, sending shivers through a tightly policed community. Could such cruelty ever be justified as law? Capital offenses were reserved for the gravest transgressions: arson, assault against a white person, rebellion, where death awaited in executions that could be as brutal as burning at the stake or hanging. Accounts describe such punishments as not only legal, but spectacles of terror designed to quash any thought of revolt. Even the smallest acts of autonomy threatened the code, and slave patrols enforced a regime of surveillance and violence. Worship, gatherings, and movement required white supervision, fracturing enslaved communities through rigid control. This cold logic of surveillance was a weapon as sharp as any blade, cutting through hope and connection. Yet, beyond these shadows, resistance lived, fragile but unyielding. The story of the 4 enslaved who bound and whipped their overseer becomes all the more poignant within this brutal framework. Their act was a radical inversion. The whip, symbol of their oppression, turned into a tool of defiance. This violent rebuttal challenged a legal regime that sought to define not only their bodies, but their very souls. The lash's sharp crack, whether it fell on backs or on the ruler of pain, sounded like a question across the cotton fields. When law is cruelty, what is justice? And in the twisting ropes and raw skin of rebellion, a story of resilience and relentless spirit was inscribed for generations to come. The thin wooden planks of the courthouse floor creaked beneath the steady rhythm of footsteps, a stark contrast to the heavy silence that cloaked the chamber. The 4 enslaved individuals stood, bound and measured, not just by ropes, but by a legal system designed to extinguish all hope. Mississippi's 1852 slave codes had stripped away any pretense of due process, transforming justice into a spectacle of subjugation. Without indictment or counsel, these trials deemed guilt in advance, their sole purpose to vindicate power and validate pain. Was this justice, or a grotesque mimicry of it? Their offenses, conspiracy, assault against the overseer, were serious in law and deadly in implication. The whip and the gallows awaited, their presence a grim punctuation to the proceedings. The overseer's testimony rang out, his voice sharp as the lash, declaring the betrayal of his authority. Yet, beneath the rigid courtroom protocol, records imply a web of fear and manipulation. Witnesses whispered with trembling lips, their testimonies shaped not by truth, but by survival instincts. The eyes of the accused flickered with quiet resolve, even as their bodies trembled in chains. How does one weigh courage within injustice's cage? Sentencing sealed their fate, a public punishment meant to etch fear into every watching eye. The lash was more than pain. It was law's voice translated into raw flesh, a brutal sermon delivered at the edge of societal order. But the lash could not silence the beating heart of resistance. The trial marked a crucible, a defining moment in the covert struggle between bondage and freedom. The overseer's control cracked that day. Under more than just rope, the lash's echo called forth unspoken truths that even in chains, the human spirit's cry for justice could not be silenced, only deferred. As the plantation's courtroom filled with a heavy silence, the 4 enslaved accused awaited their fate, weighed down by the ritual of the trial that was more performance than justice. Mississippi's 1852 legal systems denied them any voice of defense beyond trembling answers or haunting silence. Their charge, conspiracy, assault on the overseer, carried death's shadow. The overseer's testimony rang sharp, his voice slicing through the humid air like the cracks of his own whip. Yet this courtroom was a theater where power masqueraded as law, where verdicts were presumed and fate sealed before a word was spoken. How does one brace against a justice so tightly chained to fear? Witnesses spoke under duress, their words filtered through survival's prism, bending truths to protect fragile lives. The judges, seated with cold formality, acted as mere transmitters of plantation will. This was a trial constrained by the era's deafening silence on enslaved testimony, a grim reflection of laws that outlawed all but the absolute control of the planter class. Despite the looming threat, the 4 stood with a quiet defiance shaped in the cramped quarters of unyielding servitude. Their spirits trembled but did not break. Could courage flourish in a place crafted to extinguish it? The sentence, a public whipping, awaited as the final act in this dark drama. Yet even as flesh would bear the cruel lash, the act of resistance had already inscribed itself deeply into the plantation's memory. Each strike of the whip was a brutal reminder, but also a remembrance of human will defiant against the lash of oppression. This trial was not an end, but a turning point, a fractured reflection of justice poisoned by cruelty. The lash's echo, resonant and unyielding, whispered through the cotton fields. The spirit of resistance could never be fully broken, only buried, waiting beneath the weight of silence. The overseer's fate was sealed not just by the blows he endured, but by the reverberations they sent through the plantation's fabric of power and control. As the four enslaved people transformed the whip from an instrument of torture into a weapon of vengeance, a fracture appeared in the carefully maintained order, the fragile veneer of authority cracked by a defiant, raw act. This moment was more than punishment or rebellion. It was a reckoning with the oppressive system itself. The overseer, once the embodiment of uncompromising cruelty, became a symbol of vulnerability, exposed beneath the lash's unforgiving strike. His control, long presumed absolute and invincible, unraveled quickly under the bind of ropes and the force of lashes delivered by those he once ruled. The wielding of the whip by the enslaved was an inversion that challenged centuries of systemic violence, a fierce testament to humanity's refusal to remain silenced. Though punishment and reprisal swiftly followed, the event planted seeds of resistance, quietly, invisibly, enduring beneath the surface of plantation life. Each cracked lash not only tore flesh, but echoed with the possibility of change, a question hanging in the humid Mississippi air. When the instrument of pain becomes a tool of justice, what is lost and what is gained? This reckoning transcended the immediate violence of the act. It punctured the myth of invulnerability around the overseer, and by extension, the plantation system. The whip's crack resounded beyond the fields, a sharp sound against the heavy southern air that could never be ignored. It whispered truths about oppression and resilience, law and rebellion, control and freedom. The overseer's fall was the beginning of a story that would ripple through generations, a legacy marked by pain, yes, but also by the unyielding pulse of resistance that defied every lash and every law meant to bind it. Beneath the relentless sun of Mississippi's cotton fields, resistance to bondage took many shapes, often invisible yet powerful. In the 1850s, enslaved people across the state employed subtle acts of defiance to endure and unsettle their captivity. Work slowdowns became a common form of protest. Limbs ached deliberately, progress stalled under watchful eyes, and tools were sometimes purposefully broken to disrupt the grueling rhythms imposed by overseers. Such acts, while seemingly small, were cracks in the plantation's carefully constructed order. Would the master's wrath break the spirit, or would these tiny resistances fan the flames of greater rebellion? Among whispered gatherings, stories filtered through the night air, tales of secret literacy classes, religious meetings held under shadowed boughs, and quiet plans shared between trusted comrades. These hushed moments forged cultural and spiritual links that the slave codes sought to sever. Yet, even under constant threat of brutal punishments, hope found ways to flicker. The scars left by the overseer's lash were not just wounds of flesh, but reminders of a spirit unbroken, a collective memory of courage passed in whispered song and stories told beneath the stars. How can a soul be truly shackled when its stories refuse silence? Though Mississippi experienced few outright revolts in this era, conspiracies and planned uprisings stirred fear among planters. Rumors of rebellion haunted the halls of power, driving harsher slave codes and relentless patrols. Yet, as the story of four enslaved souls binding their overseer and turning the whip upon him shows, resistance was not only about defiance, but reclamation, an assertion of humanity in a system designed to erase it. These acts, small or large, ripple across history's fabric as enduring testaments to resilience, signaling that even in the darkest fields, the desire for freedom glows undimmed. The worn leather of the overseer's glove, cracked and stained by endless summers under the sun, lingered like a silent witness in the heavy air of the Mississippi plantation. The land stretched beyond, a flat expanse of cotton and dust, but its surface barely betrayed the violence woven into its roots. No ledger entry could capture the sound of a rope pulled taut or the scrape of worn wooden shackles rubbing raw skin. In the year 1852, under the relentless southern sun, four enslaved souls held a secret. The weight of their decision pressed on their backs and whispered in the heat-thick night air. Would their desperate act of vengeance fracture the chains that bound them, or simply tighten the noose? The plantation was a self-sustaining world unto itself, rigid in its brutality and routine. From dawn, the overseer's voice cut through the cicada hum, an iron command shaping each moment of forced labor. This was not merely a farm, it was a system governed by laws carved deep into the land and flesh alike. The slave codes of Mississippi dictated the boundaries of life and death, enshrining the overseer's whip as a grim instrument of order. The cotton fields, endless and merciless, bore witness to scars mapped in crimson. Laborers wore coarse linen shirts and threadbare trousers, their hands calloused by the sting of sun and soil, their breaths ragged in the thick air. The cycle of punishment and survival ebbed and flowed like the tides of the nearby river, relentless, unyielding. But beneath this iron surface lay hushed voices and whispered plans, shadows weaving secrets in the small cabins hidden within the plantation's vast reach. 4 figures lingered in the darkness, hands trembling as they tightened knots and exchanged furtive glances, bound together by a shared fury. Their hearts thundered in time with the scrape of rope and clatter of tools, each sound a pulse in the slow build of rebellion. Would the night hold their secret, or would the wind carry their cries into the unforgiving daylight? The whip, a tool twisted from domination and pain, would itself become their weapon of reckoning. This intangible transformation was as fragile as the thin cotton threads that clothed their bodies, yet fierce as the fire simmering beneath their skin. In the silence of the quarters, the air tasted of sweat and ash, a stark reminder of the overseer's cruelty etched into countless memories. His shadow, long and crooked, prowled the fields by day and haunted the dreams by night. Records imply that his punishments were savage, swift, a manifestation of a system that sought not only to control bodies, but to break spirits. Yet the very instruments of his power, ropes, whips, chains, were turned back upon him in a defiant act that would ripple beyond the fields. How does one measure justice when meted in strokes of pain? Would their vengeance unravel the fabric of their captivity, or simply weave new patterns of despair? As the 4 moved together under moonless skies, the world seemed to contract to the tactile rough rope against calloused fingers, stale air thick with anticipation, and the muted crack of leather against flesh. Their breaths came in shallow bursts, eyes darting for unseen dangers. The act they committed was irreversible, a fracture in the plantation's facade. In that moment, the whip was no longer a symbol of oppression alone. It was an exclamation of survival, a violent punctuation in the long, silent story of resistance. As dawn threatened the horizon, the future hung suspended on this visceral barter between pain and power, cruelty and courage. The lash would crack, not just on the overseer's flesh, but across the fractured soul of a system whose shadows still lengthen today.